Hello, everybody. Dan Tomaszewski here with Everything MSP. Hope everybody's having an awesome day, and it's some beautiful weather here in Michigan. And our guest today is John Shier, who is in another area that Toronto, which is also pretty decent weather, right? Just a little bit behind us, like we were just talking about.
Yep.
John is the senior security advisor for Sophos, and he has been with Sophos for more than 2.5 decades now. Is that correct?
No, not quite. 14 years.
14. Okay, so almost two decades.
Yeah.
That's impressive these days. You know, I mean, with people moving around a lot, having somebody with some tenure like that is awesome to see. So you have decades of cybersecurity experience, and I would gather that the hair might be because of being in cybersecurity.
Sometimes it is, yep.
Exactly. So it's that's always the fun part, right? So what I do know that you are passionate about protecting consumers and organizations about advanced threats. You've done research on everything from costly ransomware to illicit dark web activity and uncovering insights needed to strengthen proactive cybersecurity defenses. Additionally, you have often been consulted by the press. It's always great to get that call from the press, right? Because that means you are the man.
I'm a man.
Yeah, exactly. Been quoted in publications like Reuters, Wired, Fortune, CNN, The Hill, Fast Company, Yahoo, and as well as some other ones. Frequent speaker at industry events like RSA, InfoSec, and more. I think you got your hands full. You're pretty busy there, and we welcome you. Thank you for being here today. We're going to talk about 5 signs that you're about to be attacked. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John.
Great. Thank you very much, Dan. Yeah, I have been around for a little while, and as I set up my deck, let me talk a little bit more about why you should listen to me, or maybe why you shouldn't listen to me, but specifically about my role at Sophos. I work in the office of the CTO. And what we do, at least what I do in my group is, we're a very small group of 2, is we take care of understanding the threat landscape, but we do it from a fairly high level compared to some of our other teams within Sophos. We've got our Sophos Labs, we've got the threat research group that does all the anti-exploit stuff, the CryptoGuard stuff. We've got the Sophos AI side of things. So we've got lots of different groups that generate threat intelligence, that generate protection, more importantly. And then what we do is we kind of take all that information from the threat side of things, then we kind of look around and see what's happening in security, and then we try to synthesize that into advice for people. So a lot of the events and stuff that you've been talking about, the reason I speak to the press is because I kind of get all this information and I try to collate it and put it into ways that people can understand. And then more importantly, what I aim to do is provide some defender guidance as well, so that people are able to act on some of the information that I'm giving them, and so that they can better protect themselves going forward. So, and that's what we're going to do today. So the talk here is centered around a few different things. So research from our rapid response group, which is, these are the folks that you call when things hit the fan. If you're under active attack and you need help to recover, or you've just suffered, let's say, a ransomware attack, and you need us to figure out, how, why, when, all this kind of stuff. This is the group that gets called and comes in and does the investigation, does the cleanup, and gets you back on the right footing so that your business continuity can continue. And then there's also some of the surveys that we've done, the global. The global research survey we've done, we've split it up, and the first one that actually just got released today, first part of that global survey, was the State of Ransomware 2021, where we look at what's ransomware look like, in the past year, and then we compare and contrast that with some of the earlier reports that we've done in the past years as well. And then just, my knowledge on how different groups operate, the tools and tactics they use, and then we'll get into a little bit about defense as well along the way. Just some of the things you might want to consider that you might want to do if you're looking to be a bit more resilient and robust against the cyber criminals. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about bad actors. And oh, wrong deck. All right, let's talk about these guys instead. Nation state, it's working from left to right. You've got nation state actors, you've got then in the middle organized crime, APT groups, and then you've got your script kiddies on the left, right? To give you an idea of what these different groups look like. So the nation states are obviously the people like North Korea who are, basically they need money because of all the pressure from sanctions. So they attack cryptocurrencies exchanges and they do all sorts of shenanigans with cryptocurrency and other things. Iran, who uses a lot of civilian hackers for military purposes. Russia, obviously we know about their disruption and social influence for global election meddling, not just in the US, but elsewhere around the world as well. And we've also seen some kinetic attacks against Ukraine, like the black energy attacks from some years back. And then China is really involved in a lot of IP theft and supply chain compromise as well. And then on the APT/organized crime, when I say APT, it's not the state-sponsored ones. It's the other ones that are just kind of independent operators, if you will, but they do sometimes work with some of these nation states as well. And inside that, you've got a lot of specialists, and you've got really a market that's been broken down by your skill set. And whereas, contrasting and comparing that to the nation states, you've got different groups that are often very involved at different phases of the attack. And with the organized crime and APT guys, for a long time, these were all under one roof, if you will. And so, the guys do initial access and then persistence and then execution and then exfiltration, right? Those were 4 different functions, let's say, within a nation state, and organized crime used to bundle those together. But now we've seen a breaking apart of some of these things as well. So there's lots of specialties out there, like the initial access brokers, the one that gets you onto the machine in the first place. You've got people that do translation, right? So you got to translate these websites and these ransom notes into different languages. Money launderers, even down to money mules on the street, physically people going into, to withdraw money from ATMs and laundering money in different ways. Programmers, tech support, all sorts of other functions that these people use. And then finally, you've got at the bottom end is the script kiddies and the people that really are into stuff like DDoS stressing. They whip up IoT botnets and participate in more of the ransomware as a service side of things, the stuff that requires low skill but can have high impact as well. And the thing that we need to really note about the way that these actors are organized is that a lot of the tactics, techniques, and procedures, a lot of the way that they operate, the tools that they use, the things that they do, flows downhill from the nation state down to the script kiddies. And what's been somewhat concerning and interesting, intriguing, but concerning is we're also seeing now that the nation state actors are adopting some of the tactics and tools and techniques of the organized crime people and even some of the script kiddies. They're trying to hide in the noise because for the longest time it was easier to separate some of these groups. And now they figured, well, why don't we just look like your average, organized criminal out there? It'll be a lot easier for, a lot more difficult for people to attribute it to Iran or North Korea or Spain, just to pick another country that's not usually named. So these are the people that we have to deal with on a daily basis. And these are the people that you guys are protecting your customers from. And I want to talk about how these people get in the first place. Like, how do these groups get onto these networks and then cause the damage that they do? Well, if you're thinking about nation state, something like Hafnium obviously comes up, right? The Chinese group that was heavily abusing the proxy logon exchange server vulnerabilities that were released, earlier this year, and we're installing a lot of web shells on people's machines. And this is what this kind of attack requires a lot of resources. You need, if you're going to go and try to develop 0 days, you're going to need a lot of resources. You're going to need people that really understand how these operating systems, these applications work. And you're going to put in a lot of work, not only to discover the vulnerabilities, but also to hopefully make them stealthy and weaponize them in a way that allows you to get to your objective. And but that's really not the bulk of who we're dealing with on a daily basis. Now, let's not forget that these do flow downhill, like I said earlier, right? So we've seen when these attacks came to light in early March, we started seeing then other groups using some of these exploits as well to do stuff like ransomware. Now, if you haven't or if if your customers haven't patched yet for this kind of thing, you really can't wait. I'm still hearing of people falling prey to things like Hafnium because people are still not patching their Exchange servers. But if you have patched, the second thing you need to do for when a big story like this breaks is you need to look for web shells. So even if you have patched, did somebody get in before you got a chance to patch, and did they install something on the network? So you do need to go look for things like web shells, because just patching for the vulnerability doesn't get rid of any implant that was already put on there. Now, for the most part, the stuff that we have to worry about in terms of protecting the customers that are all under our collective umbrellas is these sort of three things here. So you're talking about remote services, we're talking about vulnerabilities again, we're talking about email. So on the left-hand side, the picture, there's just a very basic Shodan search of, I just put in remote desktop, right? Nothing fancy. And just off of that basic search, I got 3.9 million hits. So that tells you there's a lot of RDP exposed. And some might say, well, given the amount of computers that are probably out there, is that really a lot? Well, I'd say, how many computers does that represent? Does that mean there's 10 computers behind that, or is it 100? Is it a million? Not a million. Is it 1,000? Right? What's the X factor here that we need to multiply that in terms of, if I breach one of these computers, how many more do I get access to? So this really is a problem, because as I'll allude to later on in terms of the way that these groups get in, RDP specifically in remote services as a whole is something that gets abused quite a bit. And then you've got your vulnerabilities, right? So the stuff that comes out every single month, and for the most part, things like browsers, they've been patching automatically for years, and it's not a concern. And Windows 10 is doing that these days as well, more or less for most organizations. But the April bulletin. So I was looking at this particular bulletin that just came out on the 26th. That's yesterday, I guess. 197 assigned vulnerabilities. That means they've got assigned a high, medium, or low rating. 30 of those are high, and that also includes the QNAP vulnerabilities that you may have heard about that were being abused by this group called QLocker, which is basically, it's ransomware that didn't even try to be that stealthy or sophisticated. These guys found out, they found out about the vulnerability. They were able to then break into these QNAP devices, and using 7-zip, just basically password protect a whole bunch of the files on there, right? So they basically encrypted them by compressing and then applying a password to them. And what was different about this than some of the other ransomware, where we've seen ransoms in the millions of dollars, these guys were actually, you can tell they were going after consumers and small businesses because they were charging about $500 a piece, and they've allegedly made about $260,000 in 5 days. And then you've got 145 medium vulnerabilities, 22 low, and then you've got not yet assigned, which is like all the other vulnerabilities that were released as part of this bulletin that don't have a severity rating, and there's 302 of those. So some of those could be, all of those could be high as well. You compound that with things like the Oracle Critical Patch Update, the CPU that comes out quarterly. Now there's 390 Oracle patches in that. So you can, the mind kind of reels when you think about all the work that needs to be done to protect against this kind of stuff, but it's really critical and important that we do take patching seriously. And what's nice to see is in one of the latest surveys we did do, that patching, the delta between a patch coming out and the patch being applied was actually pretty low these days. It's been shrinking for year on year, which is really nice to see. We just need to get that as close to 0 or 1 as possible. And then finally, there's email, good old email, right? It's still the #1 threat vector according to the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report that just that from this past year. It's the thing that it's the technology that keeps on giving for cyber criminals. And then some people say, okay, well, how does this all manifest itself? Well, one of the ways is you can go on the dark web and you can find these portals that'll sell you RDP access, right? These services, they will, some of them are called groomers. They will actually find remote access, a RDP server, they'll brute force their way in, and then they'll groom the access to make sure that they've got administrative access, they've got maybe additional points for assistance, and maybe they've got some other, you can see about the screenshot here, they've got some other things like they'll tell you what operating system it is and other things like that. So, and then they'll sell that off to other groups, and depending on the level of access they have, it's going to determine exactly how much they might charge for that. And I just recently completed some research on the rapid response engagements that we've done for 2020, and we'll be publishing that along with some of our managed threat response stats in May, I think, in time for RSA. But some of the things I found were interesting. So as far as remote services as a category, so those include things like VPNs, right, VNC, SSH, and RDP. A lot of remote service was being abused as an initial access into organizations for specifically with, I looked at 81 reports, 81 engagements that we did, and 50% of those, it was identified as initial access was remote services. Further to that, 73% of those involved RDP. So you can see RDP is heavily represented in that. And one of the groups out there, RIAC or Conti, they've been actually actively running these large-scale brute force and password spraying attacks against exposed RDP these days, just as a way to get their foot in the door to continue with the rest of their operation. And RIAC is, or Conti, I guess you should call them Conti these days because they've rebranded, is one of these ransomware operators. Another way is through, I guess I said SMTP or email. But again, if you want to get access to email from the spamming side of things, you can go to one of these sites, again, available on the dark web, and you can buy access for as little as $1. But you can also buy other things, right? You can buy compromised SMTP servers. Again, they've got access to things like RDP or compromised cPanels or compromised shells. Like basically anything you can think of that's been compromised is bundled up and sold for a price on the dark web. And where some of these email troubles start are often with groups like Emett. And now some of you sharp-eyed people out there may be saying, but John, isn't Emett dead? Absolutely, you're right. Back in January of this year, there was a massive global takedown of the Emett botnet, which was, the billion-dollar botnet. According to some accounts, around $2.5 billion of damage was attributed to this botnet alone. And they've been around since 2014. They started life as a banking Trojan, but as they, kind of modified their code and went along and featureized and did all sorts of other things, they were able to pick up customers along the way. And then most of their customers ended up being banking Trojans. And so you can see a smattering of them here in the screenshot. So I use the screen even though Emmett's not around, just to show the relationships because it's a nice infographic. But these relationships are tried and true. TrickBot and RIAC are working very closely together, and there's some suspicion they might be the same group. Now that Emett is gone, however, we still haven't, and actually the 25th, so a couple days ago, you may have also read in the news that the FBI, along with Europol and some other law enforcement agencies, just did a cleanup of all the existing infections of Emett out there. But there's other things like Bootloader and BazarLoader and ViewerLoader, which are acting the same way as Emett is. They're acting as initial access brokers. They're getting onto the network, and then they are using that access to then further download additional payloads, which then can lead to additional trouble like ransomware. So, once TrickBot, for example, is done stealing all your financial information, they will sell their access to a group like RIAC, who will then ransom you for money. So, if they've left any money in your bank account after stealing your credentials, maybe you can afford to pay the ransom at that point. But, all bets are off with these guys.
Let me just,
and then finally, go ahead, Dan.
Don't mind real quick. There are some questions out there, and just want everybody to know, keep putting your questions in chat or in the Q&A section. And the last 15 minutes, we're going to open it up to answer all those questions. So just load those questions up and we'll get to them a little bit later. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, and then the last thing, talking about BazarLoader, which is again one of these initial access brokers, recently we saw this thing called phishing with twist, because what these guys were doing is normally, when phishing comes in and if they're trying to compromise your machine, there's going to be a link or there's going to be a document in there that you need to click and enable macros or content. But what these guys were doing is they were sending this email saying, hey, your trial's almost over of this subscription, and if you don't pay up, and there's different messaging, is either we're going to charge you or we're going to cancel your subscription. Regardless, it would get some, it would get some curiosity built up in people who receive these kinds of things. So like, I didn't subscribe to this thing, and a lot of them were associated with some alleged medical companies. And you can see, this is the phishing email, one of the examples. And then what you would do is you would call the number that's in the email, and then you talk to a live operator. And the live operator would get you to go to a fake site and enter your customer ID, which is the one that's blacked out in this dear customer #BCS blacked out. And what the customer ID was for is actually to determine whether you're a real victim or not. So if I was just a researcher who called this number up and I didn't have a valid ID, what they would just say is, oh yeah, we've already canceled that and don't worry about it, and then hang up on you. But if you had a valid ID, which they kept track of, then they knew they had a live victim on the hook, and so they'd get you to go to the site, the stake site that they controlled, and they would automatically prompt you to download an Excel document. They would talk you through enabling the content, and obviously when you did that, malware was executed, and they were able to then download additional payloads like TrickBot, ICE ID, GoZ, all sorts of other malware out there. But basically what they had was they had remote access to your network at that point. There was an implant, there was some sort of remote access backdoor, if you will, into your network that they could then use further to do other things. And we've seen these links between Bazaar, TrickBot, and Conti again very clearly within some of these attack chains. So you can tell that these guys aren't really resting on their laurels when it comes to the dirty tricks that they want to try to fool us. They'll get they'll get pretty creative. So I'll have you guys pull up the first poll here because we had some polling questions, and after the polling, we'll get into the 5 signs you're about to be attacked. So the question here is, does your organization have a cybersecurity awareness program in place to address phishing? And a couple answers, yes, no, but we're working on it, or don't have any plans. So I'll let you be in control of the polling there, Dan, when you want to end it.
Yeah, we'll just give it about another 20 seconds here, and it really is just interesting going through and seeing what everybody's doing, because there are so many there's so many different strategies and approaches to handling cybersecurity, but now not all of them are really I guess I wanted to say bulletproof, but of course nothing is bulletproof, right? So so we're seeing kind of a collection of that, and one of the biggest areas that we talk about is number one, putting that plan together, having that awareness plan in place so that you're educating, because the human element, as we know, is one of the biggest risks out there, is just how well are end users prepared in an organization. And I likened it a while back when my son was getting his driver's license, and I thought, all this training that he's going through, because he's going to be driving this, few ton car, right? And, the responsibility that comes with that. Well, end users have a great responsibility too, when it comes to working on their computer, because they can do as much damage as a car could do from that perspective. So that same education needs to be put in place. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and end our poll right now, and we'll get our results. Go ahead and share those with everybody. There you go, Jen.
All right, so that's good to see, because according to our survey, globally, there was only 42% of people, and in the US, only 38% of people actually had an active cybersecurity awareness program. So as you say, a lot of companies, they sort of treat the end user as a risk, but also let's not forget that the end user it's your first layer of defense, right? They're the people that are going to spot these, they're going to get these phishes, and they're going to be the ones that potentially can alert you to a problem down the road. So you need to make it really easy for people to report. You need to make it so that it's not the kind of thing that they're afraid to report, that, if they do also make a mistake from time to time, that, they're not going to be beaten over the head with a big stick, that, you're going to at least say thank you and rush to the data center, make sure everything is batten down the hatches. But at the end of the day, users can be a real asset to companies, and this is something that we need to a culture of security to be built within organizations, and that's something all MSPs can do within their customer sets, is help them drive these cultures, these security cultures, to make sure that users understand why it's important that security be followed and be adhered to, these these practices that we tell them, and then what the consequences are, and then how to do it easily and safely. All right, so what are these 5 things? Well, the first one is, and these are all based on these engagements that we did with rapid response. So these come directly from the investigators that said, no, we see these things all the time, and every time we see these things, at the end of the day, it means that there was an active attack on the network. And one of the first signs is if you find a network scanner, especially if it's on a server. And attackers, when they finally get into the network, one of the first things they start doing is they have to search for information, right? Am I on a Mac or a Windows machine? And then what's the domain in the company? And that'll tell them, how much money these guys have. Can they afford a big ransom or not? What kind of admin rights do I have on this computer? And much, much more, right? So the attackers also want to know what else is on the network. What else can they access with this one computer they've just breached? And one of the easiest ways to do that is, to determine where they are, what they have access to, and how far they can go is with a network scan. And so if a network scanner is found on a machine, or especially a server, Angry IP scanner, advanced IP scanner, port scanner, Nmap, also Netcat, all sorts of other stuff out there that can act as a network scanner. You need to question the admin staff first and say, hey, did you put that on there? Were you doing some sort of test? Were you looking for something? And if somebody says no, then if nobody cops to it, then it's really time to investigate. And in my research, when I was looking at the top artifacts, meaning the top tools and things that were found during an investigation that contributed to an attack, 3 of the top 10 tools were network scanners. The next thing is tools for disabling antivirus software, because that's one of the things that these bad guys will do, is they'll try to basically cripple all your defenses. And the way they do that is they'll either compromise domain admin credentials, or they'll create their own and then disable the other guy's domain admin credentials, those kinds of things. But they also use tools once they have those admin rights to disable your security software. It makes sense, right? So they don't want any alarm bells ringing. They want their payloads to work. They want to be able to laterally move and escalate privileges. And so they'll try to forcibly disable and remove any kind of security application that could potentially get in their way, not just security applications, but anything else that is a potential threat to their operation. And so they use software like Process Hacker, IO-Bit Uninstall, Gmer, PC Hunter, and all sorts of other ones. And these are commercial tools, some of them, that can be used for legitimate purposes, but really in the wrong hands, just like a lot of other tools. Security teams and admins out there, they really need to question why they suddenly appeared. So as MSPs, if you're managing a bunch of networks, one of the things you might want to do is have a look at all the different software that's being used on those networks and really understand how and why those tools are being used. So, tools like features like application control within an endpoint security stack is really where you can help keep some of these tools out of there. And again, with the tools that I found when I was looking at the top 10 tools, 3 of these disabling antivirus or disabling security software tools were also in the top 10. So now 6 of the top 10 were for reconnaissance and disabling security software. Now, any detection of Mimikatz anywhere on any network should be investigated. For those who don't know what Mimikatz is, it's just basically a way of dumping credentials out of memory. So, if you see Mimikatz on a computer anywhere in the network and nobody can vouch for why Mimikatz is there, and sometimes it gets used as part of a red team exercise or pen test, or just if people are curious to see if there's any credentials in a machine, some admins will use that. But if you find it anywhere, it's a red flag, and you really need to start investigating absolutely right away and make sure that it is not a legitimate use. And very rarely do people actually use Mimikatz for legitimate uses other than pen test and red teaming. Outside of their day-to-day activities is what I mean. And this was number 4 in terms of the top 10 tools that were used in terms of commonality, right? And so attackers can also use things like Process Explorer, which is included within Windows system internals, to dump LSAS, and then they'll create this dump file and they'll exfiltrate that, and then they'll use Mimikatz offline to safely extract usernames and passwords. So it's a tool that can be used both online and offline. And very often, what Mimikatz gets used is in concert with things like PowerShell. So you can use a PowerShell script to go fetch and download and launch Mimikatz, and we've found these scripts among the repository of tools that have been used by many different ransomware gangs, including the NetWalker ransomware group. Now, as far as so when we were talking about the top 10, the top 3 tools were actually PowerShell, Cobalt Strike, and PSExec. And so, PowerShell, PSExec are both these extremely useful tools within an environment, but they're continuously being used. PowerShell is number 1. It's because of its dual use nature, again, because it's so powerful and so flexible and so extensible. It's used by both administrators and criminals alike. The next is any kind of pattern of suspicious behavior. So if you've got any kind of detection that's happening at the same time every day or every week in some sort of a repeating pattern, it's often an indicator that something else is going on your network. And that's even if malicious files have been detected and removed. And that last part is really critical, because too often when we talk to victims during the process of an investigation, they've treated a threat detection and a blocker removal as the end of the story, but all too often it's actually just the beginning of a much more serious attack. So depending on the detection, it might actually be the time where you want to start investigating. So, if you're part of a security team that's monitoring, if you've got this virtual SOC where you're monitoring a bunch of customers, if you're seeing stuff like this, or repeated suspicious behaviors, you should be asking yourself, why is this coming back? Because a lot of incident responders know that it normally means that something else malicious has been occurring that hasn't as of yet been identified. So for example, back to these, these threat chains of Bizarre Loader to TrickBot to Conti, if you've got a bunch of Bizarre Loader detections, but they've been removed or cleaned up, it doesn't mean that TrickBot didn't sneak in there, and doesn't mean that Ryek or Conti, keep saying Ryek, doesn't mean that Conti is lying in wait as they are moving around your network. So you really need to look into that. And part of my research was also looking at dwell time. And so, within the all the reports that I had, the minimum dwell time was 0. So that means that there was 0 days between when the attack started and when they discovered the attack and then call us in to help them out. But the max was 439 days. So more than a year later, we had attackers that were in a network that finally launched the ransomware. So ransomware is just the most visible thing. It's the last thing you're going to see. There was a lot of grooming and other activity that was happening in between. Now, that's quite an outlier. Which also means that the average gets drawn up a little bit. So the average in the entire data set is 39 days. But I think the more important measure is probably the median, right? So the middle mark, which is 11 days. So still, it's almost a week and a half between when the attackers get access to your network and when you find out about it. So that's and in cybersecurity terms, in terms of attacker terms, this is an absolute eternity. And then finally, test attacks, right? So occasionally attackers will try to deploy these small test attacks on a few computers at a time to see if the deployment method and the ransomware will actually execute successfully. So that they turn off all the things, that they delete all the right logs, and there's a security software still spotted. Are there other pieces of security software that they've forgotten about it? And if the security tools, stop the attack, they'll change their tactics and try again. And this definitely shows their hand, and the attackers know that their time is now limited, but you can consider this a final warning, right? And it's often a matter of hours before a much larger attack is launched. So when we look at the aggregate, when in my research, when I looked at the aggregate of all the victims that I called in a rapid response, 77% of the victims were in the U.S. InfoSec was the second most targeted sector. So this is you guys. This is people like us that also create the software, right? But technology was one of the, manufacturing was number one, but technology was a second sector that was being targeted, and 64% of the companies were 500 users or smaller, right? So they're actually, a lot of these people are going after smaller businesses. So there's no such thing as I'm too small to be a target. Now, does that mean maybe that because a lot of these teams or a lot of these organizations don't have a dedicated security team? Maybe that's why they were victims. But that's where you guys come in, right? That's where MSPs come in and can be able to help these customers avoid stuff like this. And of the aggregate, 80% was ransomware, the reason why they called. Now, that could be more, right? Because of the 20% remaining, sometimes we caught it well before the ransomware hit. It could be that another 15% of those, of the remaining 20, would have actually ended up as ransomware, but we caught them in time and we were able to lock the bad guys out. So let's talk about all these operators and really what their goal is. And I'll remind you, again, there's within the scope of a ransomware, which is what we're going to talk about now. There's also this sort of stratification, right? You've got the low-skilled ransomware as a service guys like Stop and Dharma. You've got the highly capable but very much social extortion type groups like Conti and Revel and Doppelpaymer, and then you've got the really sophisticated groups like Ragnar and Wasted Locker. And to give you an idea of how sophisticated some of these groups can be, one of the cases we investigated was a Ragnar Locker infection, and what they were trying to do is they were trying to infect the network, and it wasn't working because we had we were able to stop them with using various levels of technology. And so what they decided to do was they brought in their own hypervisor. So they downloaded a 122 megabyte VirtualBox hypervisor, which also brought in a 282 megabyte Windows XP VM, from which they then launched the ransomware attack against the network, which was really all of that, the 404 megabytes were to launch a 49 kilobyte ransomware executable. And out of that, they demanded $11 million in ransom. So these are the big game hunters. These are the guys I like to call the professional criminal pen testers, right? They'll do all the same things that a pen tester does. They just won't give you a shiny report at the end of the day. They'll just ransom your network. So these guys will stop at nothing almost to get into your networks and to execute their ransomware. And you can see a lot of the tools that I've been mentioning here. This is the NetWalker tool set, right? Just to give you an idea of some of the things that they do. You can see, there's all these PSXZ, PowerShell. It's there. We got Mimikatz, Mimidogs. If some certain security tools will get fooled if you just rename Mimikatz to Mimidogs. You've got the SoftPerfect network scanner again. You got tools like TeamViewer and AnyDex, right? You've got all these tools that get used both legitimately and some hacking tools that are just used by criminals that get used by these groups, and they kind of run the gamut across the MITRE attack matrix here. And one of the things I do want to draw your attention to, as I talked about vulnerabilities earlier and how they get used often in initial access. And you can look at the privilege escalation column. That's the third one from the left. And if we look at the CVE numbers, right, the newest one there is 2020. It's a CVE from last year, whereas the other ones from 2019, 2017, 2015. These groups know that there's a lot of unpatched software existing on networks out there. So it's really critical that we get everything patched, not just your browsers and not just your operating systems, but any other application that gets used on the network. And then, on the low end of things, you've got things like the Dharma ransomware as a service crew, where they basically, for a price, you can, and the price varies. I've seen anywhere from $500 to $5,000, but you can buy access to this toolkit, which is a modular, PowerShell toolkit that just is, we call it paint by numbers, because you really don't need to know anything. It has all the tools it needs all bundled in, and you get this menu-driven approach. So if you choose like option 52, you get a PowerShell command prompt, and if you choose option 4, you get, you launch Mimikatz. You choose option 52 or 32, it'll launch remote desktop. So really, nice and easy for anybody to use. And where these guys get a lot of their victims is through this remote desktop, these remote desktop forums where they sell access to compromised networks already. And RDP attacks, as far as Dharma is concerned, are the root cause of about 85% of these Dharma attacks. And back in 2019, when we had some data specifically about this group, when the average ransomware demand was around $191,000, the average Dharma demand was only a little over $8,000. So these guys were operating very much at the low end of the market, and they made up for the small ransom by just sheer quantity, right? Because they were going after mostly small and medium businesses, and these guys just basically take a cut of that. So just because they are operating with limited skills doesn't mean that they can't be dangerous and they can't make a lot of money. One of the things that we've also seen in the past couple of years is this shift from just encryption to encryption and extortion, or now we're starting to see just extortion only. So, the city of Johannesburg back in 2019 in October was held to ransom by hackers who stole some data from the city, and you can imagine the kind of data that a city holds on its citizens, and basically threatened to release all that data if the city didn't pay. And thankfully they didn't pay, but this kind of gives you an idea of how you don't really need to do a lot of damage, digitally to the network to create a lot of havoc and potentially make some money. And the Maze crew kind of started this back in May of 2019, but once this happened, a bunch of other crews started noticing this sort of encrypt and extort piece, and they started doing that as well. And for a lot of these groups, it's just never enough, right? I caught this tweet last year in May, which is, this company paid the $350,000 for the decryption key, but because they didn't pay an extra $350,000 to delete the stolen files as well, then they were again, left hanging with a potential breach on their hands. So these guys will stop at nothing to dip into our wallets a second, third, or fourth, or fifth time. And you've probably seen this now. A lot of these big ransomware groups out there now have these, these leak sites, right, where you can find dumps of data from the organizations which have been broken into by some, and this is one from Avidon ransomware. And I took this screenshot, I think, a couple of weeks ago. But every day you go onto these leak sites, there's more and more and more victims with varying degrees of leaked documents out there. These guys are extracting gigabytes, if not sometimes. I think there's one case I heard hundreds of gigabytes, close to a terabyte of data that have been extracted from some of these from some of their victims. And there's like this ransomware groups wiki here, which kind of gives you an idea of all the different groups out there that are operating these leak sites. If you add up the number of victims in that middle column there, it adds up to 1,746. That's as of last month, and there have been a lot more victims since then. But it kind of gives you an idea. These are just there's been almost 1,800. At this point, I'd say there's comfortably over 1,800 victims, if not 2,000 victims, that have had their data stolen and leaked by these operators. So that's just one small subset, but that's just a ton of victims. And just recently, I think it was last week, we saw what I call extortion by proxy, where there was a firm called Quanta Computer out of Taiwan, which actually builds things like Apple smartwatches and some other Apple devices. They got infected by a ransomware group, which was demanding a 50 million US ransom. And if they didn't pay before the 6 days, in this case, expired, that ransom was going to go up to $100 million. And because Quanta wasn't willing to negotiate with the ransomware criminals that had breached their network and unleashed this, they actually stole a bunch of data, which included a bunch of schematics for Mac for Apple products that they were then going to release ahead of the big spring event that Apple was holding. So basically, they were holding Apple to ransom through a third party, through another party that they'd hacked and stolen intellectual property from. So this is the depths again that these people will think to. They will use any and all kinds of tactics. I've heard of these ransomware criminals emailing. When they get in, they usually get access to everything. So they got access to the Exchange server. They then emailed the entire company of this one particular company and said, and it was aimed at the employees and said, we've got all of your personal details that we took from HR, and your management is not willing to negotiate with us. So if you don't pressure them to negotiate with us and come to the table and negotiate a price that they're willing to pay, then we'll release all your personal details. So there's all sorts of ways that these guys can use extortion to their benefit, and they continue to do so on a daily basis. Just today, just to sort of round up the ransomware side of things, just today we saw we released a report called the State of Ransomware 2021. And one of the things that I just want to give you some idea on some of the metrics that we were able to tease out of the surveys, which is back in 2020, the average the average cost of ransomware was $760,000. In 2021, that's more than doubled to $1.85 million. So you can see that there's really been this upping of the game, if you will, in terms of the cost of ransomware out there. For the U.S. specifically, that is the cost is over $2 million. So that's the cost of ransomware, meaning that's the cost of not only if you pay the ransom, but also all the remediation costs that go along with that, right? So buying new services, software, paying your staff, any kind of brand reputation or damage, everything that goes into recovering from a major ransomware attack. We're seeing that on average in the U.S. it's costing people $2.09 million. And just to put some things into perspective here, in 2020, 51% of the people we surveyed were hit by ransomware. In 2021, that number's dipped down to 37%, which is great news. But what it hides is the fact that we're seeing less quantity, but we're seeing, if you'll excuse me, more quality. So we're seeing a lot more damaging attacks. We're seeing much bigger ransoms. I mean, Acer was ransomed again for $50 million this year, right? Along with Quanta Computers and some other ones. So the money is there, and so they're focusing their efforts on really causing a lot of devastating damage, and then are they're using that to sort of to close the gap on the volume, if you will. Now in the U.S. it was 51%. So and that's not a huge surprise because there's a lot of businesses in the U.S., a lot of money in the U.S. So the focus is very much on the U.S. in terms of in terms of victims for these ransomware crews. We also asked, how many succeeded in encrypting your data when you were attacked by a ransomware crew. And last year it was 73%, and that's dropped to 54%. So that's really good. That means that there's less people getting their data encrypted. Also, we've noticed that last year the percent of people that were attacked by ransomware crews that stopped at the encryption was 24%. That's risen to 39% this year. So our tools are more effective. The things that we're doing as collectively as a group to stop these guys is working. But what's also risen with the stopping of encryption is the extortion piece. So that's more than doubled from 3% last year to 7% this year. So of the people that got encrypted, of the 54% that got encrypted, 96% got their data back from all sources. That's backups and paying the data, the ransomware as well. And out of that 96%, 57% used backups. Now, here's an interesting, where it gets even more interesting to me is 32% pay the ransom. In the US, it's 48%, so 32% globally, 48% in the US. Of those that paid the ransom, only 8% got all of their data back, with 65% being the average amount of data recovered. So even if you pay the ransom, it doesn't guarantee that you're going to get all your data back. These criminals, they don't really care at the end of the day, as long as they get their money. So I would invest more into a prevention and then recovery strategy than I would to maybe lean on being able to pay the bad actors for this kind of stuff. So if we could pull up poll number 2 before we wrap up with how to defend against these things. So yeah, we asked this question again of our respondents to see, do you expect your organization to be hit by ransomware in the future? And we had a lot of interesting answers. And we asked them, well, we said, were you hit? And then, do you expect to be in the future? Yes, why, or no, why? So let's see what our respondents say here.
And everybody will get some questions a little bit after we finish up this next section here. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll here.
All right.
And
so
share the results.
83%. Good. So that's interesting, and not too surprising. I think people have a very big awareness now of ransomware, and are aware that they're not invincible anymore. So that's good. And hopefully that 83% means that you're going to do something proactive about making sure that these people don't get onto your network. Just so that just for comparison's sake. In our survey, 33% expected to be hit, in the US specifically, 33% expected to be hit and 15% did not. All right, so let's take a whirlwind tour here into how do we protect against this stuff. And the first thing I want to talk about is zero trust networking. We used to be called Beyond Corp or Secure Access Service Edge by, I think that's what Gartner calls it, but zero trust networking. And basically what that is, if you're not familiar, it's how you secure the user instead of the perimeter, right? It's wrapping security around the person that's actually accessing all these resources and doing the work. Because, in the old perimeter model, it was kind of a winner take all, right? Once you breach that outer perimeter, you were inside the soft GUI center and you had access to everything. And you could do whatever you want to your heart's content. Zero trust is more contextual. It's about who's accessing what, when, how, where. All these kinds of things go into the decisions about whether to allow somebody to have access to a resource. And it lends itself really well to remote working, as we've all found out in the pandemic, right? Remote working is probably here to stay for a lot of organizations. And so for you guys, if you're considering remote zero trust as something for yourselves or for your customers, right? Now is really the time to start thinking about it, because it does have a very strong application to remote working, because now, as I said, you're wrapping context around the actions of the user and the users themselves, so you can make better decisions about how these people access resources. And actually, we've got a poll for this as well, and I'll keep talking while the poll's up there. So if you can put up poll number 3. And so, we're doing this at Sophos. We've been on this road for a little while now, but to give you an example of what I mean by wrapping context around the user, it's, I especially during the pandemic, I don't travel. I used to travel a lot, but I don't travel anymore. So it'd be really odd for me all of a sudden. I work on a Linux machine, so it'd be really odd for me all of a sudden if I'm sitting here in Toronto and I'm using my Linux machine to access, Outlook through O365, that all of a sudden my there's a Windows machine that uses my ID to log into O365 from Spain, right? Because that probably means that I've had my credentials phished or stolen, right? And so that kind of context is really important. And what Zero Trust enables you to do is make proactive decisions about that. So let's see, who's got plans? So we've got fairly split, yes, 36%, no is 18, and I don't know is 48. So so the I don't knows, I would seriously consider you guys to at least look into it. See if it's something appropriate for you and your customers, and then what you can do as MSPs is you can guide them through the process if it's something they want to do and it's something that you can possibly manage as well for them. As far as the statistics for our global survey, so 77% globally said they have plans on doing the Zero Trust or are doing it already, and 70% of all US corporations said that they were doing it already or had plans to do it. The next is to create security cultures, right? I talked a little bit about that earlier. You know, how do you get everybody from the loading dock to the CEO or the CXO, right? Whoever that is, thinking in terms of security all the time. You know, make them understand that they're integral on keeping the organization secure, and make sure that everybody acts accordingly. You probably, you know, a lot of you probably already do pen tests for your customers or for yourselves. And if you're not, you really should be. But you know, you also need to test your human sensors, and that's why I asked about the phishing assessments awareness programs earlier. Is, you know, you need to find out how are your human sensors working. Are they working up to snuff? And the way that you do that is through some of these measurements that you apply against these phishing tests, right? And one of the things that we track at Sophos is, you know, the traditional measure of how many people click, but more importantly, what we also track, what's more important to me is how many people report, because how many people report a phish is a leading indicator of problems in your network. And if you can get that reporting level higher than the click rate, because you know, 20% of people are always going to click on those emails, right? If you can get that reporting to a high enough level, it's your early warning system, and it's the kind of thing that you can do that will really greatly proactively get ahead of some of these threats. You know, the next one is, you know, prevention, right? Prevent first, then you need to start doing detections and hunts. You know, talked about Mimikatz. If you see Mimikatz, it's time to go hunting, but you need to have the tools available to do that, right? So you need to have tools like EDR. And this is something that as MSPs, you can manage on behalf of your customers. You can be the SOC for them. You can be the ones that do these threat hunts out there, but you really need to have the tools available for when a detection gets noticed that's important enough that you need to go, okay, when did it get there? How did it get there? What other machines have been in? So let's talk about Mimikatz. What other machines have Mimikatz on them? And, you know, how do I clean all this up in one fell swoop? This is really what EDR is there to do. And you're operating blind if you're not using some tools like this. So really get, you know, on board with this because, you know, this dwell time statistics that I talked about earlier, this is where you start shrinking that dwell time down, and you can really start having a large impact on securing an organization. And then finally, poll number 4. And I'll talk through, as you guys are doing this poll, I'll talk through this a little bit, but a lot of organizations, you know, they have maybe a business continuity plan or DRP plan, but it really is just about things like fire and flood and other kinds of, you know, natural disasters, if you will, or other things. But you really need to have a plan for what happens in the event of a malware or major malware incident like ransomware or any other malware incident, because, you know, this is the reality now. We need to be able to understand what happens if we get hit by ransomware. What's the checklist of things we need to do in order to get back up and running quickly, safely, and with, you know, minimal amount of disruption to our customers, our employees, and all other stakeholders within the business. So, so yes, we have a detailed plan, 15%. That's good. You know, if we combine those two, we're talking over 90% of people have at least some plan, so that's great. So if you don't have a plan yet, start thinking about that. Start thinking about all the things you would need to do for you and for your customers if you were hit by a malware incident tomorrow or even this afternoon after you see this. And don't wait until next month to get around to cybersecurity. Let's do something about it today. So, you know, every day that goes by, you know, if you can make little security improvements along the way for yourselves and for your customers, do so, because every little bit helps in keeping these bad guys out of our networks. There's some resources you can use for, you know, additional information about the threats that we're seeing, some of the stuff that I talked about, the state of ransomware report that I said was just released today. If you want to read more about that, you can go and download that. You can read our threat report from 2021, and just all the ongoing news about threats can be found at either Sophos Labs Uncut or Naked Security. As MSPs, if you want to connect with us, you know, we basically have some resources there at sophos.com/MSP that you can use to really empower your businesses. And finally, with that, I'll turn it over. I ran a little bit long, but turn it over to some questions, and we can hopefully answer them to your satisfaction.
Awesome. There's so much information. It's just unbelievable. Your role is so critical, and your passion is important too, because I mean, that's what it takes for you to continually, and all of us really, to continually educate ourselves about the ever-changing landscape. So one of the first questions that came up is, are all web shells bad? That's the first question that came up.
Well, that depends on context, right? That depends on who put it there. So if you put it there, that's fine. If you know about it and you know how to use it, and it's you can properly access it. I feel that might have been a little bit tongue in cheek too, but obviously if you didn't put it there, it's definitely bad.
Excellent. And then if the light version of the bad actors are targeting small companies, how are they getting in? This must be different than a environment with RDP.
Yeah. So with the small guys, like I mentioned with Dharma, for them 85% was RDP, but other ways that they can get in is through phishing as well, right? So these groups that act as initial access brokers, and you can go on the dark web today and you can find markets that just cater to this and only this, which is, we have access to a network, buy it off of us, and then you can do whatever you want afterwards, right? So there's really I would say remote services are probably the top heavy side of things, right? If you can do something about ensuring that your remote services are secure, meaning for something like RDP, get it behind a firewall, hopefully with two-factor authentication, and behind a firewall, a VPN, two-factor authentication, all that good stuff, right? But then also make sure that your appliances, your external-facing appliances are patched, right? We've seen a few of these rapid response cases where they were breaching vulnerabilities in VPN appliances, right? So and firewalls. So these are really important. So there's a gamut of ways that these people can get in. Most of them is remote services, but it can be as simple as just somebody clicking a link in an email.
So when we're talking about the small companies being targeted, you said that that's increasing. So one of the things that we often tell clients when they say, well, we're small, nobody's going to target us, and and they go through the basics of, do you log into your business bank account from your computer? Do you purchase from vendors? Do you have your employees' payroll in? Are you putting in all that information? And they're like, well, yeah, I guess that's all important information. But often we say, when they're out there, they see an IP address, right? They see what they can get into, and they don't always know if it's big or small. Can you talk about how they're determining targeting the SMB market? What kind of tools they're using to be able to do that?
So one of the ways that these groups will do their reconnaissance, I guess what we're talking about here, right? They're doing target triage and reconnaissance is they might. So let me talk back to one of the things I talked earlier, which was the campaign to brute force their way in or passive spray in their way into a lot of exposed RDP machines, right? Once you get in, the first thing you do is you look at the account that you've breached, and you try to find out, maybe the name of the machine or the domain that it's joined to will give you a clue as to who you joined, and then it's Google, right? LinkedIn searches. It's these kinds of things. It's open source intelligence that'll tell you who you've breached, and then from there, what you can do is, if you're the type of specialist in initial access, you'll then start to bucket those into different groups, and you'll say, okay, well, here I've got all these companies that are in the U.S. and they're relatively small, so I'll shove those onto the market, and I'll charge, I don't know, how $15 per access, right? But then you get a company that is massive, so like the Acer one, right? For example, that was announced in the news not too long ago. You see something like that, and you go, oh, okay, that's big bananas. I'm going to take that, and a lot of these guys sometimes they'll have back channel the word I'm looking for, but partners, right? Or people that they work with, these people that they know that are skilled and can take that to the next step. And you might sell that to them for $100,000, $500,000, right? Because they know they can make millions on the other end. So you'll sell that to those guys, and they'll just run off, and then they'll do the silent slow thing. So they do actually take time to figure out what kinds of networks that they're in, and then they bucket them and they triage them accordingly. And then depending on the size, and it really is, a lot of times it's just this open source intelligence. They look at LinkedIn, they look at Google, and they say, okay, oh, you're a small manufacturing company in Iowa that only has, and some of these they'll look at. They'll have subscription services to these. I can't remember the name, but you can look at companies like financials to see how much they do every year, right? They only make about $30 million a year, so we'll breach those guys and we'll only charge them $500,000, right? Those kinds of things. So those are the kinds of things that these guys do. Yeah.
It really is amazing because we've always said for the last several number of years that the level of sophistication has just increased dramatically. And we're talking more from a perspective of the look and the feel of the emails that are coming in, or just the attempts that they're or approaches they're taking to hack someone. And really, there's a significantly more amount of very intense sophistication that goes behind the scenes that you're talking about. That's amazing, because you just think, all right, they're sending, they've got their tools out there, they're going to hack, and they're done. They're just going to grab stuff, but they have a very architected plan to do that.
Yeah, we call these automated active attacks. Basically, the automated part is usually just the first bit. It's gathering your victims, and then the active part is the hands-on keyboard bit, where once you're in the network, then you start moving around and trying to elevate privilege, lateral movement, those kinds of things, and then try to get as far and deep into the network as you can. Delete backups, right? So that's another thing. If your backups are accessible and only on the network, then you're toast, right? Because they'll just delete those. So you need to use the old 3-2-1, right? Three different, I can never remember. Do you know the ones I'm talking about? The backup strategy, right? So
yeah.
Three different backups, 2 different locations, and 1 offline, I think it is, right?
Right.
Something like that. So yeah, you need to take that approach where you have at least something offline that the crooks cannot get to, so that you have a chance to recover without paying the ransom.
Exactly. And there was another question that, and then we'll wrap this up, but the last question here was that should there be 2 versions of the top 5 signs / threat vectors, like a small versus large?
Yeah, so part of this research that I did, I just finished doing all the data collection on Friday last week, so I haven't had a chance to really crunch all of the data and analyze it all of it yet. But we're looking at ways to sort of slice and dice that data to understand, within certain industries, what are the most prevalent attacks and tools, and within certain sizes is actually one of the things that we're looking for as well. Within certain sizes of victim, what are the things that bubble up to the top? So I don't have that for you guys yet, but stay tuned. We will publish that report. I believe that the publish date is like May 18th. At least that's the target, I think, for the report. And we'll hopefully have some of these slices in there, because I'm not in charge of actually analyzing all the data. But
Sure.
Yeah, we have seen some trends, and I would say that of the stuff that I talked about today, if we even look at the sub 1,000 user organizations, it was 74%, I think it was, if memory serves, were in our rapid response cases. And so you can really map those tools to anything under 1,000 was being used by, and PSExec and PowerShell was almost in every single organization that we saw.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And so with that being said, I would like to wrap up. We went a little bit longer, but it was very, very good information. So well worth the extra minutes here. And everybody, I just wanted to mention a couple things. The work from home, as John mentioned, is here to stay for a while. I don't think we'll be seeing it go away. Many companies have determined that this test has worked, and many people are going to continue to work that way. So, it's really impacted the cybersecurity landscape. And so we need to continue to look to our vendors like Sophos for not only for the education, but the tools. Sophos has, if you go to sophos.com/MSP, you'll be able to find more information there. And we'll also include, when we send out this recording, we'll include some information for you as far as who to contact at Sophos if you have additional questions. And then last but not least, we have an incredible amount of responsibility that we have taken on by becoming managed service providers and assisting our customers. And I think it's way more than we really are imagine at this point. And our customers are trusting us greatly with that. Now, the thing is, like, when attacks happen, when ransomware happens, as we all know, we could put all the technology and security tools in the world in place, but nothing is bulletproof. But when you take a look at companies going out of business after they've been hit with ransomware, it happens. Think about from a perspective of a smaller company that might not have very good cash flow. They might have a large ransomware bill in front of them. Maybe they're looking for $10,000, $20,000. They don't have the money. There's nothing they can do, and their business is gone, is dead. And so we need to do whatever we can to educate and protect our clients and continue to offer new solutions as the cybersecurity landscape gets more dangerous. So with that being said, John, thank you very much for your time and expertise. I really enjoyed everything you had to say today. And everybody, we appreciate you being here. Look for an email from us that will include a survey and a replay of today's event. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Take care.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, John.